This is a study of Daniel chapter 1, the narrow path. The study is broken down into 4 parts. The first part being King Hezekiah chose to glorify himself instead of God. The second part, in return God punishes the kingdom of Judah. The fourth part is, during the time of Judah's punishment, God tested his servants, followed by God's servants must choose either to conform to the world or risk suffering for righteousness' sake. King Hezekiah chose to glorify himself instead of God. This is part of the lesson where we learn, do not be conformed to this world. In Isaiah chapter 39, we see King Hezekiah being tested by God. Before this took place, Hezekiah was deathly ill. God told him through the prophet Isaiah to get his house in order because he was going to die. In return, King Hezekiah cried out to God for mercy to extend his life. And God did show him mercy and caused him to recover miraculously. After a while, God chose to test Hezekiah to see if he would be faithful. This is displayed in Isaiah chapter 39. So would Hezekiah remember God and glorify him to these men from Babylon by telling them about how he miraculously recovered from his illness, since these men knew about Hezekiah's deathly illness and his recovery? So let's take a look in Isaiah chapter 39 to see exactly what happened and what the king chose to do. At that time, Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he had heard that he had been sick and had recovered. And Hezekiah was pleased with them, and showed them the house of his treasures, the silver and gold, the spices and precious ointment, and all his armory, all that was found among his treasuries. There was nothing in his house or in all his dominion that Hezekiah did not show them. Then Isaiah the prophet went to Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say, and from where did they come to you?" So Hezekiah said, "They came to me from a far country, from Babylon." And he said, "What have they seen in your house?" So Hezekiah answered, "They have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing among my treasures that I have not shown them." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated unto this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And they shall take away from your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." So Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good." For he said, "At least there will be peace and truth in my days." So we see how Hezekiah made the wrong choice when he was tested, and he chose to be like the world, to boast in his earthly riches, instead of glorifying God, which was a perfect thing to do in this setting because his recovery was miraculous, and it was like he had miraculously forgotten everything that God has done and could only focus on glorifying his earthly wealth. Part 2. God punishes the kingdom of Judah. This punishment is documented in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Starting at the 15th verse, it states, "And the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending them, because he had compassion on his people, and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and that had no compassion on young men or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand. And all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Then they burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all his palaces with fire, and destroyed all his precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons, until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. Part 3. During that time of Judah's punishment, God tested his servants. This time of testing is documented in Daniel chapter 1. It states, starting at the first verse, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men, in whom there was no blemish, good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of the time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azrael, or Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave to Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, and to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So we see the indoctrination of God's servants into the kingdom of Babylon. We also know, if we're familiar with the Old Testament, about the laws against going into foreign lands and learning their ways, taking on their customs and eating their foods. Yet here God's servants are, in this land of wickedness, this land of testing, this land of punishment by God on his people for their sins. And so these three, who's being pointed out here, or these four, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, here they are in that time of testing where they have to choose to either go along for the sake of not coming under the king's wrath personally, or standing up to the kingdom of Babylon in order to maintain their convictions about who they are as a people, as God's people, as God described them in Exodus. He told them in Exodus chapter 19, verses 4 through 6, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which I shall speak to the children of Israel." So here God is calling them his special people, his holy nation, his kingdom of priests. This is the identity of the people of Israel, special above all the people of the earth. And here, this time of testing makes them choose, are they going to maintain that right for themselves, to behave as and to remain under the identity of God's people, or to submit to the kingdom of Babylon because they're strong, they're powerful, they're ruthless, they're harsh, and they have no problem with killing anyone who gives them any problems or any opposition. And of course, it's also stated in Deuteronomy chapter 18 about how God views his people, starting at verse 9. He says, "When you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord, and because of these abominations, the Lord your God drives them out from before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For these nations which you will dispossess listen to soothsayers and diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not appointed such for you." Again, showing that God requires them to live up to a high standard. And so Daniel and his companions have to choose. Are they going to stay safe in Babylon at the point of compromising their identity before God? Or will they stand up to the kingdom even at the cost of their lives? So indeed, during this time, God's servants are tested. Part 4. God's servants must choose to either conform to the world or risk suffering for righteousness' sake. As we see in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel and his friends are faced with the choice to either conform to the world of Babylon or stand up to the kingdom of Babylon and risk coming under the wrath of King Nebuchadnezzar. So it states in Daniel chapter 1, starting at the 8th verse, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented, and with them in this manner, and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the men, or all the young men, who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine which they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king has said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. So here we see that unlike King Hezekiah, Daniel and his companions made the right choice when they were tested. And God blessed them for it. They could have died, but instead God chose to preserve them and made them more healthier in appearance than the men of Babylon because of their faithfulness. And this isn't an isolated incident. Instead, this is the example of all believers. We see the same admonition of holy living that we see in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. For example, Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 states, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Also, we see John's warnings about not loving this world in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, where he states, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever. If only King Hezekiah learned this passage in his day. And we also see Peter, him addressing the church. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, he tells us, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but now are the people of God, who have not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. So we see that God does require his people even to this day to live up to this holy identity that he gives them. Even so much so that Jesus tells them in Matthew chapter 10, verses 27 through 39, in regards to their work of service for him. He states, whatever I tell you in the dark, speak in the light, and what you hear in the ear, preach on the housetops. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. For are not the sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore. You are of more value than many sparrows. Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set man against his father, and daughter against her mother, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And that man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. Therefore, in our day, God's people must learn from the examples of Hezekiah of what not to do, and the examples of Daniel and his companions of what to do during times of testing, which is to not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. We're transformed by renewing our minds to the Word of God. His is the only law we care about living for. His law is all that matters. So that means that if we have to choose to either suffer the wrath of this world for the sake of inheriting the kingdom of heaven, that's what we choose. If we choose to be faithful to God at the cost of the riches of this world and all that it has to offer, remember that the world is passing away. He who does the will of God will abide forever. But those who live for themselves are dead even while they live. As God told us that we are to love Him with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And Jesus says that we are to love Him so much so that our love for anyone else is like hatred. Because we must be willing to take up our cross and deny ourselves and follow Him. So Daniel and his companions are not an isolated incident. Instead, God's people are also tested. But if we are conformed to His Word, during that time of testing, we won't be confused or fearful. Instead, we'll understand the time we're living in and how to respond, because we'll know what God's perfect and acceptable will is. So this is the study of Daniel chapter 1, the narrow path.